DE and I, the letters are in the wrong order, and they're missing a little bit too. I mean, one of the things that I think executives and hiring managers alike get wrong is thinking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, starting with diversity to bring in diverse talent. Well, you can hire as many Black people and Hispanic people as you want and Asian Americans as you want, but if your culture isn't set up not just to retain them, but also make them feel like they're safe and they're welcome and they belong there, it will be a revolving door.
I'm Devin Reed.
And I'm Sheena Badani.
And you're watching Reveal, the Revenue Intelligence podcast powered by Gong.
Keep watching here to see the full interview. Or if you like to listen to podcasts on the go, check out the links in the description below.
And if you like what you hear, subscribe on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, or Spotify, or all of them. Why not? And while you're there, make sure to leave us a 5-star review. We personally read every single one, and I think I speak for both of us when I say they mean the world to us.
Could not agree more, Devin. Now, without further ado, here's the episode you've been waiting for.
Sam, thank you so much for hanging out with us on Reveal. We're happy to have you.
Happy to be here. Thanks to you both. It's exciting to be here.
So we like to always do a bit of an icebreaker here. And I saw on your LinkedIn bio, you have this quote. It says, meet people where they live their lives to gain an authentic understanding of the factors that define who they are as central to every winning campaign. I'd love to just know, what does that quote mean to you and why did you decide to put it on your LinkedIn profile?
If you think about GOTV, so that quote to me represents both politics, business, public affairs. I mean, basically motivating people, and it comes down to contextualization. It comes down to what matters to people, where they are, where they live their lives, and specifically GOTV, getting out the vote on a campaign. I mean, it's one thing for a candidate or a human being in any regard to convince someone to vote for them based on their policies, based on what they want to do to transform the world or the government or the country. It's an entirely different thing to motivate a person to get off their couch, get a babysitter, stand in line for 4 hours, perhaps in the rain, take time off from work. Some people can't do that, so it's a massive hardship to even be able to do that. And again, to motivate a person to do that, that takes contextualization. It takes them caring about, them seeing themselves in those policies. So if you look at GOTV and then think about that approach and think about it as GOTC, get out the customer, GOTB, get out the buyer from a B2B approach, or GOTP, get out the policymaker. If you take that same approach, you need that contextualization. You need to know what they care about, what motivates them, what defines their fears and their hopes and their wants. And that becomes the underpinning to motivate people to move forward. So that's what I meant by that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm all about it. I lead a marketing team, and we're all about the reader, learning about, what do they care about? What do they care about right now? And how can we, motivate them to take action? You motivated me to take action just now, because I'm not afraid to admit it. I did not know what GOTV stood for. So I want to confirm my quick Google search was correct in case any listeners were also scratching their head. Is it get out there and vote?
Get out the vote. Yeah. And
get out the vote. Okay.
I shouldn't have assumed that my wonky background that everybody would know what that means, but yeah, get out the vote. So it's essentially, again, store knockers, it's policies, it's motivating people through large scale events. It's meeting people where they are in a lot of different ways. Digital is much more powerful now because of just access to technology. But yes, it's get out the vote. Thanks for looking that up.
Happy to show my ignorance.
Thanks for asking for us, Dev. And so that question just alluded to the fact that you've had a really interesting background. You've spent a lot of time working in politics. You've also been on the business development side and have a sales angle to your career. So talk about this either blend or transition from politics into sales. How did that happen? What motivated you to do that?
That's a great question. I grew up in politics, as I mentioned when we met. My dad worked for the Carter administration, and I thought everybody's dad worked for the president when I was a kid, which is not actually a thing. But I was around that world literally my whole life, as long as I can remember. And outside of a couple years as lead singer in a band, that's what I've done my whole life professionally. And doing it on multiple presidential campaigns from 96 all the way through this last cycle, and really understanding, again, grassroots and understanding what drives people, and seeing the approach transform over the course of almost 30 years from robocalls and mailing into something that now is a digital activation around mailing, but more use of digital that targets people where they are. I mean, that's really where the industry is going, is direct communication. But to your point, I worked in the Clinton administration after that campaign, after the 96 campaign, and then after the 08 campaign, worked in the Obama administration at education. In that role, it was a couple years in scheduling in advance, which is a logistics and gatekeeping role, and then took the White House liaison role at Department of Education. And that's a mix. It's about 50% just catch-all with things that are coming from the White House and trying to figure out the political, how to navigate when Ed wants to talk about one thing and the White House wants to talk about another on a Wednesday. And the other half is hiring all the political appointees, being the main conduit for hiring the 180 political appointees. I raised that because of the recruiting angle then. Politics, again, trying to develop an EQ and an adaptability quotient as well to figure out what makes people tick and what drives them, both to find the right person for the roles, but also sell them on taking a role that's almost always a pay cut, hours that are incredibly long, but for a purpose, which, again, is in the ethos of the person who wins the White House. And after 8 years in the administration, I went to a digital agency, huge, largely because I was really interested in the fourth industrial revolution, seeing what it had done within schools and then what was becoming a skills gap and the future of work, and jumped into business development as soon as I got there. I was briefly in comms, and they asked me to be more of a person that would help them bring in business, and I loved it. And it dawned on me that it's very similar, again, to what I'd done in politics and meeting people and just being out there and understanding the zeitgeist. I love that word. One of my colleagues at a previous job at BCW, Kristen Hooper, talks a lot about zeitgeist, and again, tapping into what people care about and where they are. That's fluid. You referenced that to some degree, Devin, a minute ago. That's always changing. So unless you have your finger on the pulse and understand it, it's not relevant even a week or 6 months later. So all of that is to say, after a couple years at Huge, I went to another digital agency, Outcast, which was the 800-pound gorilla in Silicon Valley, and worked for them for a brief time before coming to BCW, working in their business development and marketing space, and then now this role at Rational 360. But to your point, it's all kind of the same ecosystem. It's figuring out what motivates people. Selling someone to take a job, selling someone to get off the couch and vote, or selling someone on a capability that isn't just something that you hope they buy, but that you know actually will help them, will help a company navigate through problems, data-driven capabilities that will actually either figure out what they actually need to do or helping them do the very thing that they've realized they have to do. It's all very much the same ecosystem. I'm answering your question. I feel like I'm battling the point.
No, that's great. And actually, it's so interesting to think about the parallels between sales and politics. Like, if you can get an individual motivated enough to do something on behalf of their country, you could take those same skills, those same perspectives, and get them to motivate them to do something on behalf of their company. So it's really interesting to think about how you took your experiences and the skills from one arena to a totally different one. So really, really interesting food for thought. I do have to say that I did pull up Google, just like you did, Devin, a second ago for zeitgeist.
For zeitgeist, right? Okay. I knew what this one meant, but I almost heard it again to make sure.
I love it. I am learning new stuff on this conversation, so that keeps me motivated and happy.
It is a fun word. Lovely. So, Sam, you were just talking about purpose, right? Because if you're going to get someone to take longer hours, potentially make less or a lot less money, then purpose is usually the thing on the other side of the scale, right? That balances it out or tips it in your favor. And so you're a very, purpose-driven individual. What does that mean to you to be purpose-driven?
I mean, it means taking a stance. It means getting off the sidelines. When I say purpose, I've spent my whole life in progressive politics. It's no shock where I stand politically. But purpose, the word purpose doesn't necessarily mean Democrat or liberal. Purpose is getting off the sidelines. And, up until 2 or 3 years ago, it was more, for some brands and companies, it was more of a risk to get off the sidelines and stand for something than it is now. Now the risk is not getting off the sidelines. And that's being driven by a whole massive evolving ecosystem of stakeholders. I mean, that's government officials, that's analysts, that's reporters, that's consumers, that's B2B buyers, parents. I could go on and on. It's just become such an outcry from everyone to lean into this. And it's easy for people to say that COVID caused it. I think COVID amplified it. COVID amplified it. Murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor amplified it. Joe Biden winning amplified it. But if you think about prior to that, Larry Fink called this out in his letter to CEOs 3 years ago, that purpose would become table stakes. And the BRT changed their charter before COVID happened. That happened in late 2019. So, and again, I think where we have come now with what was building before, I think largely because there's a new generation of people coming online in more senior roles, millennials that are very purpose-driven themselves. But as they're stepping more and more into that ecosystem that I said before, they're bringing people along with them, their parents and their friends. So even boomers are becoming purpose-driven, and we're realizing that is what is needed to move the world forward. So again, there was a point a number of years ago where My Pillow, for instance, came out in support of President Trump, and totally different ecosystem, totally different area of politics than I obviously agree with. But overnight, they lost 50% of their 2,000 customers and gained another, I think, 40,000 customers or something insane, because they took a stand.
Wow.
May not have been what some people believed was right, but they got off the sidelines. So for me, I mean, my definition of purpose is my own and definitely more progressive. But again, it really is a risk now for brands not to stand for something, not to get off the sidelines. And that goes for the people inside companies as well. CEOs with exec comms. CEOs have to have a perspective on this as well. For employees, too. Employees will leave companies that aren't starting to think about this in certain ways and go to other companies that are, because it makes them feel like they're actually making a difference in the world. So, again, for me, it's getting off the sidelines.
Well, you made a great point or example there, right? Which is when you have a purpose and then you outwardly share what it is, you're naturally going to divide the room a bit, right? And so, like you said, My Pillow lost half of their customer base. If you stopped there, you'd be like, no purpose for me. I'm good. I'm keeping it to myself. Then you just said, hey, I don't know what the math is, 80x, whatever that is, 40x. I got to, or whatever the number is, a lot more customers because of it. So how do companies decide maybe like what their purpose is and how to share it externally, right? So like you're attracting the right people, even if you're okay saying, hey, we're going to lose some people, but in the long run, that's not the right group that we want anyway. Does that make sense?
It does. Yeah. And just to be fair, the reason I raised My Pillow is growing up in the Midwest and spending my life in Democratic politics, but trying to be more of a moderate. I felt like I needed to at least talk about the more conservative side of what purpose is, as I now arc much harder towards the more progressive one. But I mean, again, that stakeholder ecosystem, the kind of purpose that they're demanding is equity, is lifting up marginalized communities, underserved communities. And underserved communities doesn't necessarily just mean Black and brown communities. That's definitely a community that is the system is set up to fail in a lot of ways. But even rural America, even people that voted for Donald Trump in West Virginia and in the rural South that don't live near anything, don't have broadband internet or have access to healthcare or telehealth because of the lack of internet. I mean, they're underserved as well. So for me, my previous job at BCW, one of the things that I ran at the moment I got there with people like Kristen Hooper, who I had mentioned, and Carol Watson, who runs their I call it IDEA, Inclusion, Diversity, Equity, and Accessibility, was this idea of a polycultural communications ecosystem. And again, that's what matters to people where they are in all communities. But that's not all lives matter. That's specifically in rural America, specifically for veterans, specifically for women, specifically for Black and brown communities. I go on and on and on about that. But now taking that ethos to my new role at Rational 360 and thinking about, again, how much more the world is moving towards the use of digital to reach people where they are. Healthcare will be massive. And again, thinking about the bipartisan approach, one of the things I loved about them is that they are a much more politically driven firm that I come from. So it's a better fit for me just to be involved with political animals. Back to your question, though, specifically around how companies can do this. It's just that. It's figuring out what matters to their employees, figuring out what matters to their customers. They can do an assessment and figure that out. Is it Ford? Is it a small foundation? Is it Accenture? Is it Deloitte? Their stakeholder ecosystem first is to figure out who are the people that they feel like they need to move. the purpose that they need to take doesn't necessarily need to be what the whole world wants, but they need to figure out who their stakeholders are and what they care about. Most of the time now, that is more progressive, more lifting up marginalized communities and thinking about how to create more equitable outcomes and not just giving access to communities, but not just democratizing it, but actually making it accessible. But it's just that. It's figuring out why are they doing this, who are the stakeholders they want to move, and then from there working backwards. Now, the tactics, again, could be an assessment. It can be working with their employees as well and having town halls on the record, off the record to figure out what drives people. And also creating a culture of belonging from an employee perspective. But again, is this B2B? Is it B2C? Is it a company that works more with the government? Everybody has stakeholders, and now that's fundamentally different than it was 3 years ago. So that's the first big step, is figuring that out. Who are their stakeholders?
For companies, I think there's some companies that have like very clear purposes, and their executives are very vocal about it, and they have comms and media efforts like specifically focused around that. There are other companies, maybe they don't feel like, they could be doing better. Where does this purpose come from? Does it have to come from the founders? Is it top down? Like, is there a way to kind of bring it up from existing employees? How is it really created?
All those things, honestly. And a company doesn't, I think there's this misnomer that for a company to lean into purpose, especially if lifting up marginalized communities and specifically Black and brown communities or women or veterans, that they themselves have to somehow look and be like those communities. And maybe that was the case at one point, but that all changed when George Floyd was murdered. All of that expectation of having to prove yourself as an ally went away. Now there's an expectation, or to prove yourself as an ally, now there's an expectation of allyship and of equity. And I think a company can draw from a lot of different sources now to your question. It doesn't have to just come from the board or just come from investments that they're making or just come from a traditional legacy history. And they can find themselves on their own allyship journey in a lot of ways. And even if they're just starting, even if they've never tweeted about this, they've never made a single investment, there's a place to start. And that doesn't even necessarily need to be $100 million like Apple is investing in tearing down structural racism, in institutional racism. It can also be a company that lifts up other nonprofits and charities in communities where they have plants or headquarters through the heft of their brand, partnering with them and having an activation and putting it on social media, or just letting people know that they are there. So there's more awareness of fundraising and cash flow to those organizations that help those communities. That's a good place to start as well. And back to this expectation of allyship, one of the things that was one of the brightest spots of my time at BCW was that I was the executive sponsor, one of the executive sponsors of their African American Employee Resource Group. And again, I'm a white guy from Missouri. I'm the last person that you would think would do that. But because of this expectation now, and me being somebody who cares about this deeply, have my whole life. My wife was biracial. I try to see the lived experience through her eyes that I'm never, ever going to understand, but got to check myself and make sure that I'm saying things that are at least empathetic and understanding what I don't know and pushing myself out of my comfort zone. But that wouldn't happen 3 years ago. It would have been, wait, who are you? You're doing what for what group? And it wasn't even an afterthought. That the fact that I was able to do that, and it was honestly one of the most humbling and rewarding experiences of my entire life. But back to your question, companies now can fire on all kinds of different cylinders with ERGs, with partnering with nonprofits, with pulling in perspective from an outside advisory council, convene a group of 20 people at nonprofits, big and small, across the country to have them be your advisory group on what you don't know and what purposes actually to invest in or lift up through the heft of your brand. So it doesn't need to be in a vacuum like it perhaps needed to be 5 years ago.
So many great tips in that. I love that. Like, you don't have to do this on your own.
No.
Get some outside counsel. Talk
in
to
fact,
others.
if you do it on your own, in some ways now that would be considered more tone deaf, because I mean, in some ways there's the business case that we hear about for inclusion and diversity. Is based to some degree on the moral imperative, but also how retention and culture. There's so much more to it, though, than that. When you think about bringing people in with diverse perspectives, I mean that mix of perspective gets to creativity much more quickly, gets to innovation much more quickly, can push through problems, get to growth. One of the reasons that the Biden administration is leaning so hard into inclusion and diversity across all the agencies. One, it's the moral imperative. I've known President Biden since I was a kid. When my dad worked for him in '88, I know most of the people coming in the administration, they're good friends. I know that they care about this. I was one of them during the Obama-Biden administration. But there's also the operational imperative and the innovation imperative of bringing people in to the government, but also transforming the culture at the Pentagon, for instance, creating a culture of belonging and respectability and tearing down obstacles like sexual assault and harassment to make every American feel like they can serve will supercharge innovation in competing with China, both economically and from a defense perspective, being able to come up with solutions to problems that other countries just can't. That, in many ways, having such a diverse populace is a superpower for the U.S. So when you bring not just diverse perspective and people that have lived different lives and see the world differently, but frankly, communities that, again, the system in a lot of ways is set up to fail, naturally just have to push through harder to get to something that maybe is democratized, but it's not accessible. And doing that, living those lives, supercharges a human's emotional quotient, but also their adaptability quotient. And again, those are the underpinnings for innovation. So there's a massive case, to your point, for doing this, because companies can benefit from it in so many different ways. To answer your question, I feel like I kind of nerded out there for a second. Sorry.
No, perfect.
Okay, Sam, I'm enjoying this thoroughly. I find it very interesting. I'm curious how leaders can kind of take this, like take these insights and these kind of examples and encourage purpose-driven behavior throughout their organization. Do you have any advice for that?
I do. I mean, I would say being an example. It's one thing to encourage this. It's another thing to be an example specifically. And when I say example, I mean the way you talk to people, choosing your words in a way that is respectable, but also understands the tonality of what's happening in the world. And that's not just a matter of giving a person a half day off because they watched the news and the Derek Chauvin verdict came in and it's an emotional time. That's important, but having an open dialogue, having a culture of belonging, having the ability for people to really feel like they're bringing their whole selves. And as I say that, I've heard that so many times in decks and in articles that I've read, that it almost sounds cliche at this point, but it is so important for leaders to do that, to emulate the very thing that they want their employees or their service industry, companies that either are infrastructure that provide services or goods for larger paradigms like healthcare and the meatpacking industry and manufacturing. I mean, for companies, those executives need to lean into that and be the change agent that they want their staff to be as well. And in our conversations before, Sheena, when we were talking about some of the things to really dive into, one of the things that you'd mentioned was what companies should stop doing now around DE&I. I mean, this segues into that because DE&I, the letters are in the wrong order and they're missing a little bit too. I mean, one of the things that I think executives and hiring managers alike get wrong is thinking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, starting with diversity to bring in diverse talent. Well, you can hire as many Black people and Hispanic people as you want and Asian Americans as you want, but if your culture isn't set up not just to retain them, but also make them feel like they're safe and they're welcome and they belong there, it will be a revolving door. So starting with inclusion, starting with a culture that, again, has ERGs and has, if a company's not big enough for ERGs, a tonality from an executive so people feel like they can actually have conversations about little things that, in retrospect, aren't little, but one of our, I said African American Employee Resource Group before, the acronym we lovingly called that AIR. One of the things that I brought to the mix, and it was a little uncomfortable for me to do it because I wasn't quite sure if I was onto something, but my wife thought I was the arc towards the end of Falcon and Winter Soldier. I won't ruin it for folks that haven't seen it, but that was incredibly powerful, the way they teased that out and the way they talked about what handing the shield to a Black man, not realize the white people not realizing what that actually meant. And I brought it to the group, and we had a 2-hour conversation on it. It was so powerful, but having a culture where that's okay, having a culture where you can say words and actually explore things that mean something to you, that's creating a culture of belonging, being open to people, being who they are, You hired them for a reason. If a company hired a person for a reason, you want that whole person. You don't want them to come in and conform to the guardrails that your company has. So back to the DE&I, and I recognize it's the industry standard, but inclusion and then diversity, bringing people in that you actually want to have diverse perspectives from and that live in communities that the system is set up to fail. Equity, again, creating opportunities for people that many have and others don't have access to. So inclusion, diversity, and equity. And then the A is accessibility or accountability. Is, again, not just democratizing, but creating a culture that you're proactively making sure people have access to it and understand it. So, I mean, in some ways, back to the original question, I think that's what's so important about this for executives is to think about creating an environment that's equitable, accessible, that when you hire a person, the goal you want to have is when they come in and they start and they get up and running and they meet their colleagues and they get involved in the work, whether it's an agency, whether it's a small think tank, whether it's a CPG, that they dread the idea of leaving that job because they feel like they are a part of the fabric and they're moving things forward themselves and they're helping grow the company or they're delivering great work on behalf of clients or they're coming up with strategies for new candy wrappers, but that they feel a part of the fabric of that company, and they dread the idea of ever losing that. That's a true culture of belonging, and that's how executives need to think about this, is that get rid of your guardrails. I know that every company has a perspective and an ethos and an understanding of what they do and their legacy, but they've got to get rid of guardrails in order to create a culture that actually makes sense for people to want to stay.
So many great points in that. I can see, like, once you're an employee at a company, you have a pretty good sense of how inclusive and accepting is this company. When you are considering joining a new company, it's really hard to get that sense, right? You may see on the website that there are some ERGs, but beyond that, it's really hard to understand, like, is this a purpose-driven company? Is it for me? So I'm curious if you have any recommendations for folks who may be interviewing or looking for their next job to really find that company where they're going to fit in and be included. What questions should they be asking?
I mean, obviously questions with trying to do their own blind references with either employees that they know or people that they know that know employees with what the company is like. But I mean, look at what the company is putting out there into the world. I mean, look at what energy they have by what light they're putting out. Is there social content that's thoughtful, that points to a company that's not afraid to actually talk about this? Or look at their clients. If it's an agency, look at their clients. Look at who they work for. Restaurant 360 has us against Alzheimer's. When I saw that case study on the website and what they had done, immediately I was like, oh, this is a great company. They think about this in a way that actually will move the world forward. But again, it doesn't have to be an agency. It can be thinking about, look at companies like Bank of America, for instance. They make investments all over the country in local markets in what matters to communities there. It can be a school, it can be a community forum, it can be a park, it can be a hospital, but they make investments locally. And I think that they're doing it because, again, they want to drive up their consumer engagement and also be able to have a voice with policymakers in those local communities. But they are transforming the world in a positive way. And that's all out there on the internet. There's all kinds of different case studies and all kinds of different anecdotes for every company out there. And to your point, if a person goes to look for that and can't find any of that, any perspective on Twitter or LinkedIn or panel discussions or something that points to what they're doing in the world, good or bad, bad is obviously a red flag, but nothing is a red flag too. If a company's, not willing to get off the sidelines and take some kind of a stand on something, then that would make me take pause on, does the culture match that? Is the culture also full of guardrails, as is the voice that they have outside of their walls?
Great points on that. There is a responsibility for the company. I suspect there's also some responsibility for folks who are customer facing, who are outwardly facing in any way. So what's the responsibility of a sales rep or a sales manager or a customer success manager engaging with their clients on advocating for this purpose or communicating that externally?
I mean, you all called this out with data, what Gong does. I mean, if you go the perspective that makes sense and an argument that makes sense, that's admirable. And many clients or prospects will listen to that. But if you have data, if you can show that 90% and 97% of Americans want companies to invest in their backyard in lifting up marginalized communities and equitable access to technology and healthcare, you can actually show actual data. And a lot of times that's like a sledgehammer when clients and prospects hear that. It's like, oh, and they see the numbers and realize, oh, this isn't just somebody pitching me or a push on tonality. This is real. This is where America is moving, where most Americans are moving. So data is a huge part of that. So what you all do with bringing in data and strategy and thinking through what's around the edges that people don't see on face, that's a huge part of it as well, to be able to both sell but also create trust between sales people and growth people. I love to say strategic growth. I mean, sales is definitely powerful, but when you think about strategic growth, it's not just picking up the phone and calling someone. It's not just trying to meet a quota. It's about, again, zeitgeist and thinking about all that's out there and the fabric of society or the fabric of people that you're pitching or that you're wanting to get on the radar of. And like, I love LinkedIn. I'm a huge fan of being on LinkedIn constantly and liking people's posts and putting up my own, trying to come up with some content, putting up an article that I thought was interesting and a little quote at the top as I post it. But that's just creating your own gravity to navigate through. And what I believe is that purpose is a huge part of that purpose, and digital and reaching people where they are is what's most important right now to try and move people. But again, just even as salespeople, to your point, just getting out there. I mean, if you cold call someone, you might get through, you might not. Or even if you reach out to somebody who you know or knew well 10 years ago, you might get through. But if you're creating your own gravity and your own connective tissue out there by just putting your own things out into the world, sharing other companies' content, coming up with your own content, liking people's posts, commenting on people's posts when they get a new job, that starts to build. And that starts to be a powerful thing that you can navigate through. And then when you're sending a note to somebody you might know, they remember seeing the 3 posts, or somebody that you don't know, they remember seeing a thought piece you put up about public affairs allyship or about the anniversary of Bloody Sunday, the Edmund Pettus Bridge, or something that is specific to I keep saying the word ethos, but that's another word that I love. The ethos specific to them. Just like what I'm saying that clients and that companies need to do, the salespeople also need to have a perspective and put it out there so people will notice them and want to work with them and remember them when they come back to them. It's not nothing is a cold call at that point.
There it is, the game of unmute chicken. Sam, you saw it for a second. Sam, you're waiting there like, why didn't they respond? How come they didn't say anything? Every episode, Sheena and I play mute chicken, which is we look at each other and go, are you going to talk? Am I going to talk? And so we both are too polite. But I love what you just said, Sam. I love that you called it gravity, because I believe that completely. As you know, I lead content at Gong, and that's what we're all about is, if you understand your audience, if you provide relevant information and you're purpose driven, you do create gravity, right? It brings people closer to you, but also like-minded people closer together. And that's where the real community comes in, right? It's not just about you and those people, it's about those people with each other. So I really love how you put that.
Good, thank you.
Sheena, we went through the questions. We are at 33 minutes and a great 33. So I think we go to the last question.
Let's do the wrap. Take it away.
All right, Sam, we ask all of our lovely guests the same question at the end of the show. How would you describe sales in one word?
Sales in one word. God, that's...
Sam is thinking and buying time by drinking some of his water.
That's exactly what I did. That's right. I can't drink my water. I mean, the word, I'm not sure that this is right, but the word that came to mind when you said that was fun.
I like that.
I'm an extrovert. I love being around people. I love meeting new people and discovering new things about the world. It's one of the things I used to talk to Air a lot about, was that, I was a huge Bourdain fan. Putting yourself in other people's shoes gives you a new perspective of the world, and it makes it more colorful, more exciting, and it would be so boring without that. So being able to be in sales and in strategic growth and be out there and meet new people and discover new things, it's fun. It's enriching.
Yeah.
Maybe that's a better one.
I love it. No, I can tell from our conversation today that you genuinely believe that, just in the way you carry yourself, the way you talk about these things, like, you can tell when there's true passion. And I think too, as you're saying about purpose, like purpose can't be faked. It won't, even if you say this is my purpose, but it's not real to you, it doesn't stick. Other people don't feel that. So plus one over here, Sam. I like it.
Awesome.
Yeah, I can feel it radiating through our monitor. So really, really loved the conversation. It was a lot of fun.
Well, I did as well. And when my kids call me a nerd, I'm going to say that Devin and Sheena said I'm passionate. So stop calling me a nerd.
Yeah. And they're going to go, and they're nerds too, Dad.